The court-martial proceedings began 6 weeks after the incident, held at Peterson Air Force Base in a courtroom filled with military officers, aviation attorneys, and journalists. Rebecca had been subpoenaed to testify as the primary witness, and she arrived at the base wearing her best business suit, carrying a folder with her flight logs and incident reports. The atmosphere was formal and intimidating, but she'd prepared thoroughly for this moment. Lieutenant Commander Walsh sat at the defense table with his attorney, looking younger than Rebecca had expected. His uniform was immaculate, his posture rigid, and his expression carefully neutral. Lieutenant Parker, the second pilot involved in the incident, would be tried separately the following week. Both were facing charges of endangering civilian lives, violating federal aviation regulations, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The military prosecutor, Major Lisa Rodriguez, called Rebecca to the witness stand and began with basic questions about her background and qualifications. "Captain Martinez, please tell the court about your experience as both a military and commercial pilot." Rebecca outlined her 4 years of Air Force service, her training on various aircraft types, and her 12 years of commercial aviation experience. "Captain Martinez, on the day of the incident, were you following proper flight procedures and operating within legal airspace?" Major Rodriguez's questions were designed to establish that Rebecca's flight had been completely routine and legal, making the military intercept even more egregious. "Yes, Major. We were following our filed flight plan, in contact with air traffic control, and operating in completely unrestricted airspace. There was no justification for military intervention." Rebecca's voice was clear and confident, and she could see several members of the military jury taking notes. "Captain Martinez, please describe the tone and manner of the defendant's radio communications with your aircraft." This was the crucial question, and Rebecca had rehearsed her response carefully. Lieutenant Commander Walsh was immediately hostile and threatening. He ordered us to change course and threatened to take defensive action if we didn't comply. He made no attempt to verify our identity, coordinate with air traffic control, or follow standard intercept procedures. Rebecca's words carried the weight of her military experience, and she could see the jury members exchanging glances. The defense attorney, Johnson, began his cross-examination by attempting to portray the incident as a misunderstanding. "Captain Martinez, isn't it possible that my client genuinely believed he was responding to a potential security threat?" The question was predictable, and Rebecca was ready for it. "Mr. Johnson," Lieutenant Commander Walsh threatened a clearly identified commercial aircraft with standard transponder codes, following a filed flight plan, in unrestricted airspace. If he believed that constituted a security threat, then he lacks the judgment necessary to fly military aircraft. Rebecca's response was direct and devastating, and she could see Walsh's face redden with anger. "Captain Martinez, you used your military call sign during the incident. Wasn't that an attempt to intimidate the intercepting pilots?" Johnson was trying to turn Rebecca's actions against her, but she'd anticipated this line of questioning. "Mr. Johnson, I used my call sign to identify myself as a fellow military aviator who understood protocol and wouldn't be intimidated by unauthorized threats. It was an attempt to de-escalate a dangerous situation that your client had created." Rebecca maintained eye contact with Johnson, making it clear that she wouldn't be rattled by his tactics. The prosecution's case was strengthened by testimony from air traffic controllers, who confirmed that Rebecca's flight had been routine and legal, and by Colonel Mitchell, who testified about the lack of authorization for the intercept. The defense struggled to explain why Walsh had acted outside his authority, particularly given his documented history of aggressive behavior. During a recess, Rebecca overheard two military officers discussing the case. "That pilot's got guts," one said. "Not many people would stand up to an F-18 intercept like that." The other officer nodded. Captain Rebecca Martinez had been flying commercial aircraft for 12 years, but she'd never experienced anything like what happened on Flight 447 from Miami to Denver. The Boeing 737 was cruising at 37,000 feet when the first sign of trouble appeared on her radar display. Two military aircraft had emerged from seemingly nowhere, positioning themselves on either side of her plane. Rebecca's co-pilot, First Officer Danny Thompson, pointed at the radio with wide eyes as the military frequency crackled to life. "Civilian aircraft, this is Viper 1. You are in restricted airspace. Change heading to 270 immediately and prepare for escort to the nearest military facility." The voice was cold, professional, and carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Rebecca felt her heart rate spike as she realized the gravity of the situation. Behind her, 143 passengers continued their conversations, read their books, and dozed peacefully, completely unaware that their flight had just become a potential national security incident. Rebecca grabbed the radio microphone with steady hands, though her mind was racing through every possible scenario. "Viper 1, this is commercial flight AAL 447 en route from Miami to Denver. We are on filed flight plan and have been in contact with Atlanta Center. Please advise nature of the restriction." She kept her voice calm and professional, knowing that panic would only escalate the situation. The military pilots flanking her aircraft were close enough that she could see their helmets turning toward her cockpit windows. "AAL 447, you have violated restricted airspace associated with ongoing military operations. Comply immediately or we will be forced to take defensive action." The threat hung in the air like a sword. Rebecca's hands moved automatically across the instrument panel, checking their position, altitude, and heading. According to every navigation system on the aircraft, they were exactly where they were supposed to be, following the flight plan that had been approved by air traffic control hours earlier. Danny was already pulling up the restricted airspace charts on his tablet, his fingers flying across the screen as he cross-referenced their position with known military operating areas. Becca, we're not in any restricted zone. Look at this. He held up the device, showing their current position clearly outside any marked military airspace. Rebecca studied the display, confirming what she already knew. They were in completely legal airspace, following a routine commercial flight path that hundreds of aircraft used every day. The radio crackled again, this time with a different voice. Viper 1, this is Viper 2. That aircraft is squawking a standard commercial transponder code. Are you certain about the airspace violation? Rebecca felt a small spark of hope. At least one of the military pilots was questioning the situation. She keyed her microphone again, this time with more confidence. Viper Flight, AAL 447. We are not in violation of any airspace restrictions. We are following ATC clearance and have been in continuous contact with Atlanta Center on frequency 124.7. I request you verify the coordinates of your restricted area. She released the microphone and waited, watching the sleek F-18 Hornets maintaining formation just beyond her wingtips. These weren't training aircraft. They were frontline fighters, loaded with weapons and flown by pilots who wouldn't hesitate to use them if they believed the situation warranted it. The lead pilot's voice returned, harder this time. AAL 447, you will comply with instructions immediately. Turn to heading 270 and descend to flight level 200. Any deviation will be considered hostile action. Rebecca felt the blood drain from her face. Behind her, a flight attendant had noticed the unusual radio chatter and was looking through the window at the military aircraft. Soon, the passengers would begin to panic, and panic on a commercial flight 37,000 feet in the air was a recipe for disaster. Danny reached for his radio to contact Atlanta Center, but Rebecca stopped him with a gesture. Something about this situation felt wrong. The military pilot seemed too aggressive, too quick to threaten. Standard procedure for airspace violations involved warnings, verification, and coordination with civilian air traffic control. This felt more like a setup than a legitimate intercept. She'd heard stories from other pilots about military exercises that went too far, about young hotshot pilots who saw commercial aviation as beneath them. Viper 1, this is AAL 447. Before we comply with your instruction, I need to verify your authority to order course changes to civilian aircraft. What is your commanding officer's name and the nature of the military operation we're supposedly interfering with? Rebecca knew she was taking a risk, but something in her gut told her these pilots were overstepping their authority. The silence that followed her question lasted longer than it should have, and she could almost hear the uncertainty in that silence. AAL 447, you are not authorized to question military operations. Comply immediately or face the consequences. The threat was clear, but Rebecca had spent 4 years in the Air Force before becoming a commercial pilot. She knew military protocol, and this wasn't it. Legitimate military intercepts involved specific procedures, coordination with the FAA, and clear chains of command. These pilots were winging it, and that made them dangerous. She keyed her microphone one more time, her voice taking on a tone that surprised even Danny. Viper 1, this is AAL 447. My call sign is Raven 77 Alpha. I repeat, Raven 77 Alpha. Please respond with your commanding officer's verification. She released the microphone and waited, watching the F-18s carefully. Call signs in military aviation weren't random. They were earned, assigned, and known within the community. If these pilots were legitimate, they would recognize what she just told them. Colonel Mitchell's voice carried the weight of authority that came from decades of military service. Raven 77 Alpha, please maintain current heading and altitude. Viper flight, return to base immediately. Rebecca felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly as she watched the F-18s bank away from her aircraft. But she knew this confrontation was far from over. The damage had been done. Her passengers had seen military fighters escorting their plane, and word would spread quickly through social media and news outlets. Thank you, Colonel Mitchell. Request permission to contact my company operations and advise them of the situation. Rebecca knew that protocol demanded she report the incident immediately. Every major airline had procedures for dealing with military intercepts, hijacking attempts, and other security incidents. The fact that this intercept had been unauthorized would send shockwaves through both the aviation industry and military command structures. Permission granted, Raven 77 Alpha. Please also contact FAA Flight Operations on frequency 121.5 and file a complete incident report. I apologize for the actions of my pilots. The colonel's apology was professional, but Rebecca could hear the anger beneath his words. Unauthorized intercepts of civilian aircraft were serious breaches of protocol that could result in court-martial proceedings, international incidents, and massive public relations disasters. As Rebecca contacted her airline's operations center, Danny pulled up the passenger manifest on his tablet. 143 passengers, including 2 children under 5 and an elderly passenger with a heart condition, he reported quietly. We need to make an announcement before the rumors start spreading through the cabin. Rebecca nodded. knowing that passenger panic could still turn this situation into a genuine emergency. She reached for the public address microphone, choosing her words carefully. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. You may have noticed military aircraft in our vicinity during the past few minutes. This was a routine training exercise conducted by the Air Force, and we are continuing normally to Denver. We expect to arrive on schedule, and there is no cause for concern." The lie came easily. Protecting passenger safety sometimes required creative interpretations of the truth. Behind them, the cabin remained relatively calm, though several passengers were taking pictures through the windows and typing rapidly on their phones. Rebecca knew that within hours, the incident would be trending on social media platforms, and the airline's crisis management team would be working overtime to control the narrative. But her immediate concern was getting her passengers safely to Denver, and then dealing with the inevitable investigation. Danny was already pulling up the contact information for the FAA when Rebecca's personal cell phone, secured in her flight bag, began buzzing with text messages. Word was spreading faster than she'd anticipated. Her old squadron commander from her Air Force days had somehow already heard about the incident and was asking if she needed any assistance. The military aviation community was small and tight-knit, and news traveled at light speed. "Control, this is AAL 447. We need to speak with a supervisor about filing an incident report regarding unauthorized military intercept," Danny transmitted to Atlanta Center. The response came immediately, indicating that air traffic control had been monitoring the situation and was equally concerned about the breach of protocol. Within minutes, Rebecca found herself explaining the entire incident to an FAA operations supervisor, who assured her that a full investigation would be launched. As they continued toward Denver, Rebecca began mentally preparing for what she knew would be a complex and politically sensitive investigation. Unauthorized military intercepts of civilian aircraft were rare, but when they occurred, they typically involved issues of pilot judgment, command structure failures, and occasionally deliberate harassment. The fact that she'd been able to stop the intercept using her old military call sign suggested that the pilots involved were young, inexperienced, and possibly acting without proper authorization. The real question was whether this had been an honest mistake, a training exercise gone wrong, or something more sinister. Rebecca had encountered military arrogance before during her Air Force service. Young pilots who believed their fighter aircraft and classified missions made them superior to everyone else in aviation. Some of them carried that attitude into situations where it could become dangerous, and it appeared she just encountered a prime example of that phenomenon. The landing at Denver International Airport was smooth, but Rebecca could feel the tension in the cabin as passengers prepared to disembark. Several had approached the flight attendants with questions about the training exercise, and she could see people holding up phones, trying to capture images of what they assumed were routine military operations. The truth was far more complex, and Rebecca knew that within hours, a very different story would emerge. As the passengers deplaned, Rebecca remained in the cockpit, completing the extensive paperwork that would accompany her incident report. Danny was coordinating with the airline's operations center, ensuring that their next flight would be covered by reserve crew while they dealt with the investigation. The airline's chief pilot, Margaret Sullivan, was flying in from the company's headquarters in Chicago specifically to handle the situation. "Captain Martinez, we need to talk." The voice belonged to Agent Kevin Torres from the FAA's Flight Standards District Office. He'd been waiting at the gate when they arrived, along with two other investigators and a representative from the airline's legal department. Rebecca had been expecting this meeting, but seeing the serious faces of the investigators made the reality of the situation sink in deeper. The conference room at the airport was sterile and windowless, filled with the kind of fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. Rebecca sat across from the investigators, her logbook and flight bag on the table beside her. Agent Torres opened a digital recorder and placed it between them, his expression professional but not unfriendly. "Captain Martinez, we need you to walk us through exactly what happened during the intercept," Torres began. "Start from the moment you first detected the military aircraft." Rebecca took a deep breath and began recounting the incident, from the initial radio contact through her decision to use her old call sign to identify herself to the military pilots. "The pilot seemed unusually aggressive," she explained. "Standard protocol for airspace violations involves coordination with civilian air traffic control, verification of the violation, and graduated responses. These pilots went straight to threats of defensive action without following proper procedures." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "In my experience, both as a military pilot and a commercial pilot, this behavior suggested either inexperience or deliberate harassment." Agent Torres nodded, making notes on his tablet. "Tell us about your military background and the significance of your call sign." Rebecca explained her 4 years of service as an Air Force pilot, including her time flying transport aircraft and her eventual transition to commercial aviation. The call sign, Raven 77 Alpha, had been assigned to her during her final year of military service, and it carried specific meaning within the Air Force community. "Call signs aren't random," she continued. "They're earned through service, performance, and peer recognition. When I transmitted that call sign, I was essentially telling the intercepting pilots that I was a fellow military aviator who understood protocol and wouldn't be intimidated by unauthorized threats." The investigators exchanged glances, clearly understanding the implications of her statement. The legal representative, Attorney David Chen, leaned forward. "Captain Martinez, are you alleging that the military pilots were acting outside their authority?" The question was loaded with legal implications. If the intercept had been unauthorized, it could constitute a federal crime, endangering civilian lives, and potentially creating an international incident if foreign nationals had been aboard the aircraft. "I'm stating that their behavior was inconsistent with standard military protocol for civilian aircraft intercepts," Rebecca replied carefully. "Whether that constitutes unauthorized action is something for the investigation to determine." She knew that her words would be scrutinized by military investigators, FAA officials, and potentially congressional committees if the incident escalated. Agent Torres closed his tablet and looked directly at Rebecca. "Captain Martinez, based on our preliminary investigation, those F-18s were conducting a training exercise approximately 50 miles south of your position. There was no active restricted airspace in your flight path, and no authorization had been given for intercept of civilian aircraft." The room fell silent as the implications of his statement sank in. "So this was completely unauthorized?" Rebecca asked, though she already knew the answer. The investigators nodded grimly. "The pilots involved have been grounded pending a full military investigation," Torres continued. "Colonel Mitchell has requested a meeting with you to discuss the incident further. The military is treating this as a serious breach of protocol that could have resulted in a catastrophic incident." Rebecca felt a mixture of vindication and concern. She'd been right to stand up to the unauthorized intercept, but she also knew that challenging military authority, even wrongful authority, could have consequences for her career and personal life. The aviation industry was small, and word of her confrontation with the F-18 pilots would spread quickly through both civilian and military circles. The meeting with Colonel Mitchell took place 2 days later at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs. Rebecca had driven down from Denver, taking leave from her regular flight schedule while the investigation continued. The base was familiar territory. She'd trained there during her Air Force service, and the sight of F-16s and F-22s on the flight line brought back memories of her military career. Colonel Mitchell was waiting in his office, a man in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of bearing that came from decades of military leadership. His uniform was crisp, his desk organized, and his expression serious but not hostile. "Captain Martinez, thank you for coming. Please have a seat." He gestured to a chair across from his desk, and Rebecca noticed that the meeting was being recorded, standard procedure for military investigations. "Colonel, I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me," Rebecca began, maintaining the professional courtesy she'd learned during her military service. "I understand there's been some concern about the actions of your pilots." Colonel Mitchell nodded, his expression growing more serious. Captain Martinez, I need to be direct with you. The pilots involved in the intercept of your aircraft were acting completely outside their authority. They were conducting a training exercise in a different sector and decided, without authorization, to investigate what they perceived as suspicious civilian aircraft activity. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Their actions endangered 143 civilians and created a potential international incident. Rebecca felt a surge of anger at the casual way the colonel described the investigation of her aircraft. Colonel, those pilots threatened to take defensive action against a clearly identified commercial flight following a legal flight plan. That's not investigation, that's harassment. She kept her voice controlled, but her military training allowed her to speak with authority to a superior officer when the situation warranted it. You're absolutely right, Captain, and I want you to know that both pilots have been grounded indefinitely pending the outcome of a formal court-martial proceeding. Colonel Mitchell opened a folder on his desk and pulled out several documents. Lieutenant Commander Bradley Walsh and Lieutenant Jessica Parker, both relatively new to the squadron, both with records of what their previous commanders described as aggressive interpretation of rules of engagement. Rebecca recognized the type immediately. Every military unit had pilots who pushed boundaries, who believed their training and equipment made them superior to civilian authorities. She'd encountered them during her own service, and she'd seen how that attitude could escalate into dangerous situations. Colonel, with respect, how did two pilots with documented discipline issues end up in positions where they could intercept civilian aircraft without authorization? The colonel's expression darkened. That's exactly what we're investigating, Captain. The training exercise they were participating in had specific parameters and geographic boundaries. They exceeded those boundaries and engaged in unauthorized activities that violated federal aviation regulations and military protocol. He leaned forward, his voice taking on a more personal tone. When you transmitted your call sign, you essentially reminded them that they were threatening a fellow military aviator, and that's what caused them to back down. I transmitted my call sign because I wanted them to understand that I knew military protocol and wouldn't be intimidated by unauthorized threats, Rebecca clarified. I was trying to de-escalate a situation that could have resulted in tragedy. She paused, considering her next words carefully. Colonel, I need to ask, was this incident isolated, or have there been other problems with unauthorized military intercepts? Colonel Mitchell was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing how much information to share. Captain, there have been 3 other incidents in the past 18 months involving unauthorized approaches to civilian aircraft by military pilots. None escalated to the level of your incident, but the pattern suggests a systemic problem with pilot judgment and command oversight. The admission was significant. It meant the military was dealing with a broader issue of pilot misconduct. What kind of consequences are we talking about for the pilots involved? Rebecca asked. And what assurances can you give me that this won't happen again? She knew her questions were pointed, but she also knew that her experience could help prevent similar incidents in the future. Lieutenant Commander Walsh and Lieutenant Parker are both facing courts-martial for endangering civilian lives and violating federal aviation regulations. If convicted, they could face dismissal from the service, significant fines, and potential civilian criminal charges. Colonel Mitchell's voice was firm. Additionally, we're implementing new training protocols and command oversight procedures to prevent similar incidents. Rebecca appreciated the colonel's directness, but she also understood that institutional change in the military happened slowly. Colonel, I respect the actions you're taking, but I need to know that my reporting this incident won't result in retaliation against me or my airline. She'd heard stories of military personnel who'd reported misconduct facing harassment and career sabotage. Captain Martinez, you have my personal guarantee that there will be no retaliation for your actions. In fact, your professional handling of the situation prevented what could have been a catastrophic incident. Colonel Mitchell stood and extended his hand. The military owes you a debt of gratitude, and I hope you'll consider working with us to improve our training protocols for civilian aircraft interactions. 3 weeks after the incident, Rebecca was back to her regular flight schedule when she received a call from James Morrison, a reporter for Aviation Week magazine. She'd been expecting media attention, but she'd hoped it would die down quickly. Instead, the story had gained momentum as details of the unauthorized intercept became public, and other pilots began sharing their own experiences with military harassment. Captain Martinez, I'm working on a story about unauthorized military intercepts of civilian aircraft. Would you be willing to speak on the record about your experience? Morrison's voice was professional but persistent. Rebecca had been advised by her airline's legal department to limit her public statements while the investigation continued, but she also understood the importance of raising awareness about the issue. Mr. Morrison, I can confirm that I was involved in an incident where military aircraft intercepted my commercial flight without authorization. Beyond that, I need to refer you to the FAA and military investigators who are handling the case. She kept her response neutral, but she could hear Morrison typing rapidly on his keyboard. Captain, I've spoken with other pilots who have experienced similar incidents. There seems to be a pattern of young military pilots using civilian aircraft for unauthorized training exercises. Would you agree with that assessment? The question was leading, but Rebecca recognized that Morrison had done his homework. Mr. Morrison, I can't comment on other incidents, but I can tell you that the military has acknowledged that the pilots involved in my incident were acting outside their authority. I'm confident that both the FAA and military investigators will ensure that appropriate action is taken. She ended the call politely but firmly, knowing that her careful response would likely be quoted in the article. The following week, Aviation Week published a comprehensive story about unauthorized military intercepts, featuring Rebecca's incident as the lead example. The article included interviews with 3 other commercial pilots who'd experienced similar harassment, as well as statements from FAA officials and military commanders acknowledging the problem. Rebecca was portrayed as a hero who'd stood up to military bullying, but she felt uncomfortable with the attention. Her discomfort increased when she received a call from Lieutenant Commander Walsh's attorney, requesting a meeting to discuss her testimony in the upcoming court-martial proceedings. The attorney, Marcus Johnson, was polite but clearly hoping to minimize his client's culpability by portraying the incident as a misunderstanding rather than deliberate harassment. Captain Martinez, my client acknowledges that he made errors in judgment during the intercept of your aircraft. However, he maintains that he believed he was following proper protocol for investigating suspicious aircraft activity. Johnson's voice carried the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to defending military personnel in difficult situations. Mr. Johnson, your client threatened to take defensive action against a clearly identified commercial flight following a legal flight plan. That's not investigation. That's intimidation. Rebecca's response was direct and uncompromising. She'd agreed to the meeting out of professional courtesy, but she wasn't going to allow Walsh's attorney to rewrite history. Captain, surely you understand that young pilots can make mistakes under pressure. Lieutenant Commander Walsh is a decorated officer with an exemplary service record. Johnson was trying to humanize his client, but Rebecca had read Walsh's personnel file and knew about his previous discipline issues. Mr. Johnson, decorated officers don't threaten civilian aircraft without authorization, and exemplary service records don't include multiple incidents of aggressive behavior towards civilian aviation. Rebecca had done her homework as well, and she wasn't going to be manipulated by legal maneuvering. The meeting ended cordially but without resolution. Rebecca knew that her testimony would be crucial in the court-martial proceedings, and she was prepared to tell the truth about what had happened, regardless of the consequences for the pilots involved. They'd made their choices, and now they would face the results. 2 days later, Rebecca received an unexpected call from her old squadron commander, Colonel Patricia Hayes, who'd retired from the Air Force the previous year and was now working as a civilian contractor. Rebecca, I heard about your incident with the F-18s. I wanted to call and tell you that you handled the situation perfectly. The military needs more people willing to stand up to bullies, even when they're wearing uniforms. Thank you, Colonel. I just did what seemed right at the time. Rebecca appreciated the support from her former commander, but she also knew that not everyone in the military community would view her actions favorably. Standing up to military authority, even wrongful authority, was sometimes seen as disloyalty rather than courage. Rebecca, I want you to know that there are a lot of people in the military who are proud of how you handled this situation. Those pilots were way out of line, and they needed to be stopped before someone got hurt. Colonel Hayes' words were reassuring, but Rebecca also detected an underlying concern in her voice. Colonel, is there something else I should know about this incident? Rebecca asked, sensing that her former commander had more to say. The pause that followed was telling, and when Colonel Hayes spoke again, her voice was more serious. Rebecca, there's talk that this incident might not be as isolated as the official reports suggest. There may be other cases of unauthorized military harassment that haven't been reported or investigated properly. Your willingness to stand up to those pilots may have opened the door to a much larger investigation.